Thank you guys so much for coming to listen to this. And it's a huge project, and I've just kind of picked different things to talk about. So feel free to interrupt and ask questions if you're curious about anything that I don't go into very deeply. Um, I'm happy to answer any questions. It's a super interesting collection. So I want to talk a little bit first about an introduction about what is the Thomas Mayr collection. And in the spring of 2023, Arundel County archaeologists were contacted by the Mayr family because they told us they were ready to donate the archaeological collections of their father, Thomas Mayr, to the county. He was a very, very well-known amateur archaeologist, and he had worked closely with professional archaeologists for decades and was respected for his breadth of knowledge, his really responsible field methodology. He had such a huge, well-organized collection that everybody knew about. And he was also instrumental in the founding of multiple iterations of the Archaeological Society of Maryland, starting in the 40s and 50s. So state archaeologists from the Maryland Historical Trust have been trying to convince the family to donate the collection for years, and everybody was super excited about what we would find. And this is a photo of his daughter, Caroline, showing the award he had gotten in 1983 for his outstanding contributions to Maryland archaeology. So in the June of 2023, staff and summer interns spent an intense 3 days. We had 3 days to get everything out of the house. She wasn't sure where everything was, but so we had to look in every single room, every drawer, every bookcase. There was things scattered all over the house. And you can see in this photo, um, there were photographs, books, journals, and artifacts that were stored inside cigar boxes, money order boxes, because Mayr spent his career with the U.S. Postal Service at Fort Meade primarily, and sometimes they were just loose. Um, and you can see the guy up in the top middle, that is one of the former state archaeologists, Wayne Clark, with Jane Cox, who was the former Anne Arundel County archaeologist, and Zach Singer and I at the downstairs in this house. So basically what we were doing was there was no climate control, there was no air conditioning in the house. So we were worried about bugs. So we bought Ziploc bags, um, wrote any notes that we saw on the outside of the box, tore anything we saw on the outside of the box off if we could, and then poured everything into Ziploc bags. There were about 7 of us working 8 hours a day for 3 days. It was cuckoo banana pants. So Tom was also caring for the collection of Henry Sturdy, who was a professor at the Naval Academy, who was also a very well-known amateur archaeologist who collected throughout the state starting in the late 20s or early 30s. And in his basement, he had Henry Sturdy's collection as well. So we had to deal with that as well. And that is me on the left holding an axe the size of my face. And you can see our interns pouring artifacts into bags there on the right. So a few months later, we had to go back. Oh, sorry. And you will see on the right-hand side, this is a log cabin. We went back and had to, they called and said, we found artifacts in the back of a shed. They need to be out by the end of the day. This was at 3 o'clock. The state archaeologist called us. So Drew and I went over, and most of the boxes, a lot of them had been eaten by mice. They had been outside basically. So if you touched one, it would crumble to dust. So we had to not touch it and try to write down any provenience information so that we could keep the artifacts. We ended up having to leave behind um, hundreds of artifacts because we had lost any context or provenience information because of the way they were kept outside. Since that time, we've stabilized the collection. We've begun identifying represented sites. We've started cataloging artifacts and started updating documentation with the help of a 2024 Historic Preservation non-capital grant from MHT. So here's some stats on what we found so far. There's 103 registered archaeological sites represented. There are 95 new sites or unidentified sites, like sites we know what county they're from, and we have notes from him that tell us where he found them, but we haven't quite figured out exactly where that is. They just need a lot more work. 85 total boxes of artifacts, another 10 boxes of notes and books. The majority of the sites represented are from Anne Arundel and Prince George's County, but there are many, many other counties represented and a few other states as well. Mayr collected a lot of artifacts from a handful of sites. He would go to the same sites over and over again along the Patuxent, and Henry Sturdy collected just a few things from lots and lots of sites. So kind of a different ways of collecting. So why is the Mayr collection important? The reason is that Tom Mayr focused his collecting along the banks of the Patuxent, mostly in Anne Arundel and Prince George's County, and he visited the same sites systematically over decades while he kept detailed notes. Now, archaeologically, we know that people have lived along the Patuxent for at least 10,000 to 13,000 years because we found Paleolithic points on at least 3 sites along the river, including one site that was collected by Tom Mayr at the called the Rough Site. Now, many of the archaeology sites along the Patuxent in Prince George's, Calvert, and Anne Arundel counties that have been registered with the state were first documented by the first state archaeologist, Tyler Bastian, who was the state archaeologist from 1969 to 2001, which is a crazy long career. And his informant was Thomas Mayr. And Mayr was trusted enough that the sites were documented by his word alone. He would take him out physically to the field, show him where it was, and that was it. He would only show his collections to a few archaeologists. He would not let them be photographed. And he would only tell them a general description, like, I found early woodland artifacts, but he wouldn't show them to Tyler. So Tyler just trusted him that that's what he found, and he ended up being right. So unfortunately, by the time these sites began to be documented in 1969, a lot of them had already been destroyed by decades of sand and gravel extraction along the Patuxent River. So the Patuxent is on the coastal plain, and southern Maryland is the largest producer of sand and gravel in the state. And most of the principal upland deposits or downland deposits are along the banks of the Patuxent and Potomac rivers. There's just huge amounts of sand and gravel that are very easy to mine and that are really important for road building, constructing houses. It's a huge industry and that continues to this day. There's huge gravel quarries out there. So for most of these, or for many of these destroyed sites, the only collections that any archaeologist knew about were held by the Mayr family, and nobody had ever seen them, cataloged them, or photographed them, and they remained a total mystery. So let me give you some concrete examples of what this means, and I'm going to focus on a small area. This is a general map showing the area I'm looking at. Since this is going to go up on YouTube, I couldn't show you the exact locations of sites since they're protected, and there are some very important sites that have had some problems with looting. So we're going to look at 2 miles of the Patuxent River, starting at Route 50 and going south. And along the banks of the west side of the river in Prince George's County and the east side in Anne Arundel County from the banks of the Patuxent to a road that just runs along it, there are 21 documented archaeological sites recorded in Medusa just for those 2 miles. And of those 21 sites, only 2 were not originally identified by Thomas Mayr to Tyler Bastian. Of the 19 sites that were originally identified by Tom, 11 are known to have been destroyed by mining or development. 6 may be partially extant. There hasn't been further work done, but when you look at overhead photos. Some of them have had housing developments, so there might not be much left of them. And two are part of one National Register site. And it's interesting to see what documentation looks like currently for destroyed sites. So currently, for context, the current form, this is new actually, that the Maryland Historic Trust requires for an archaeological site to be recorded in the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties is at least 8 pages long, could be more for a complex site. And so this is some of the information that they want for example, a pre-contact site. And you can see they want a site type. So for example, is it submerged? Is it just a lithic scatter? Is it a shell midden? Does it seem to be a village? What kind of categories of artifacts exist? What kind of material are those artifacts made from? Are there diagnostics, meaning datable artifacts? Like, did you find a projectile point type that we know a general date for? Um, Sorry, I'm looking at too many screens at once. And are there features for the site that might help us understand a little more about the use of the site, or we might be able to get charcoal from for dating? Um, so now I'm going to show you documentation for some of the sites that were first identified by Mayr. Now you can see this is the winter site, 18AN 70. Now, in the collections that we just got from him, there's a total of 820 artifacts. 569 of them are ceramic sherds. Um, he had more ceramics in this collection that we just got than the state collections repository has in total. And he basically took Tyler Bastian out, who has atrocious handwriting, I gotta say. And the only thing he told them was the site was destroyed, and it says T. Mayr reports early to middle woodland. And that's it. No pictures. He didn't tell them types. Once in a while, he'll say like what kind of ceramic he found. But in general, that's it. And this is literally almost all there is right now to this day for this site. Here's Lurch Rosbeck. This was a total of 1,256 artifacts, including four mortars and just huge amounts of stuff, an incredibly important site that is destroyed now, and very little information that existed. Nobody knew what kind of artifacts they had found or even how many there were. Um, Here's some things from another site that was destroyed. These are big greenstone axes. We've got soapstone tempered ceramics there on the right, Marcy Creek. That's the base of a vessel. These are huge chunks of ceramic. On the bottom, you've got like a bolas, like for throwing a weight, basically, different kinds of points. And this is a small amount of the artifacts. And here's some of those big ceramics that are beautifully decorated from the winter site. These are all mended, the items that he mended, rims from Akakeek ceramic vessels. That bottom one is particularly pretty. There's a lot of net impressed decoration plus some scratch decoration. So who is Thomas Mayr? He was born June 16th, 1912, and he passed away in 1986 in January. He was a lifelong resident of Davidsonville in Anne Arundel County, and he began collecting archaeological materials in 1926 when he found a grooved axe on the family farmstead that lay close to the Patuxent River. By the time he was 17, he had established a methodology for collecting context data for the artifacts that he was finding on properties through Anne Arundel, throughout Anne Arundel, Prince George's, and Calvert counties. And he outlines this methodology in a really interesting article that he had published in the May 28th, 1932 issue of the Rural New Yorker, which is a weekly farm newspaper that was read nationally. And he was in like the kids section, which was also had pictures of like 10-year-old kids with their pet donkeys Topsy and stuff. But he had this article which talked about artifacts and why they're important. Um, And he clearly communicates ethical concerns about commercialization of artifacts, the importance of artifacts for what they can tell us about people, as well as the necessity of context for artifact analysis. And he says, in this time I have learned that a serious and worthwhile interest in such objects is apparently almost non-existing. I say this because the interest in relics of most people is awakened not by the vast scientific value and significance attached to them, but by the misleading hope that they are worth something. In collecting relics, it is very important that the finding place of each specimen be known and recorded. Otherwise, the relic has no scientific value and is little more than a common curio. It is best to keep a sort of collecting diary, giving the following data: description and measurements of specimen, where, when, and by whom found, and numbers of specimen in collection. The specimen should be labeled to avoid any possible confusion. No fragments ought to be discarded, since sometimes they are as important as whole objects. It is surprising that we know so little about the people who lived here before us, but it is unbelievable what one can learn of them by collecting and studying the relics they left behind. And this is particularly impressive because this is before the founding of the Society for American Archaeology and any kind of ethical or constitutional statements they've made. He's a high school graduate. He's 19 years old, and he figured this out kind of by himself. Um, and this is an example of one of his notebooks. You can see on the left, he loved drawing, and we also have his high school notebooks where he would be doing reports where he would have scrapbooked out items to do with, like, the Revolutionary War or whatever. And they wouldn't be fully pasted on, and you would figure out that if you lifted them up, he had lists of artifacts that he had written underneath them. Like, he was obsessed with archaeology. And in the front of this notebook that I have an example of here, he wrote kind of a statement of purpose for his work: to awaken and promulgate an interest in our predecessors through the conservation of their remains and relics. This book is dedicated in all respect and admiration to them. And you can see on the right here, he would write down the date, he would say what site he was going to, and many of these sites have the same name now because he was the one who identified them originally. And he would say where he found the object and what he found. So on the south edge of H. Beck's orchard, found a leaf-shaped arrow point on November 21st. Sometimes he drew them as well, and his drawings got very beautiful. So Mayr was largely self-taught. He taught himself through voracious reading, as well as correspondence and conversation with professional archaeologists. He did a series of oral histories with Wayne Clark, who wants to write about him as kind of a way into the history of Maryland archaeology. And he talked a lot about kind of how he started off and who inspired him. And he says, in 1936, I became a member of the Society of American Archaeology through the encouragement of William B. Mayr, a noted historian and amateur archaeologist in Maryland. That name might be familiar because there's major awards named after Mayr from the Archaeological Society of Maryland. And he was also an important kind of founding member of the Maryland Historical Society, Maryland Center for History and Culture now. I wrote to the Maryland Historical Society for literature and archaeology, but they had none. I also wrote to the Smithsonian Institution. They sent me a list of publications of the Bureau of American Ethnology, but they were not available. In the 1920s, there was no literature to be had. My notes reflect the impact of having American antiquity volumes after 1936. So he he says that he does have some of these books from the Bureau of American Ethnology, people writing about a little bit. There's a few things about kind of the Mid-Atlantic. Most of it's about the Northeast, the Southwest. And he got them. He said that basically senators would get them, or like very important people would get them. So he would kind of talk to everyone constantly and befriend people. And when they learned he was interested, they would kind of find copies for him. So this is the way he kind of just like constantly wrote letters. We have so many letters where he's writing to archaeologists in New York State and Pennsylvania, historians in Delaware, anyone who he could find who might send him literature. And he spent a lot of time um, thinking through the oh, um, differences between the types of artifacts he was finding and the differences between artifacts on different sites. And he wrote endless comparative tables. And this is an example of one. It was in a very tiny little book from free book from a gas station. And it was all these notes he had written. And he writes at the front, the ultimate purpose of collecting is to obtain a clear definition of the various cultures through the interpretation of the data accumulated. And he spent a lot of time attempting to understand change in the cultures in the past, if they represent dates, if they represent different kinds of people that might have come through. And that's why it was so important to him to get American antiquity, because then he was able to kind of see examples of different places in the country and how what they knew about how people acted in the past and compare them. And then he started to recognize patterns. And this helped lead to his recognition of the distinctive Selby Bay point type, which was part of what he referred to as the Selby Bay complex. And Selby Bay is what it's called to this day. Um, he was, uh, as the Mac Lab say, it's in their Diagnostic Artifacts in Maryland website, Mayr was the first to publish a description of the Selby Bay complex in Maryland, which included stemmed and lanceolate bifaces made of rhyolite. These became widely known as Selby Bay points. And Mayr's 1972 article called Selby Bay in Retrospect was published in the journal Maryland Archaeology. And his work was part of a session at the Fifth Mid-Atlantic Archaeological Conference in 1974 that was part of trying to work out the boundaries of the cultural area. So it turns out that there is similar artifacts that he found in what he calls the Selby Bay complex all the way up through New York. So there was actually an entire session where people wrote papers that were kept, maybe 6 or 7 different papers of professional archaeologists in the Mid-Atlantic discussing the Selby Bay complex. How big was it? Is that what we should call it? What are the identifying characteristics? And this is mostly based on the work of this amateur archaeologist, which I think is pretty impressive. So he was also instrumental in the development of multiple organizations for amateur archaeologists in Maryland. He was first approached in the 1930s by fellow amateur archaeologists. He had a long-term correspondence with William Mary, and William Mary had mentioned that people had asked him about it. William Mary, although he was a historian, he really loved walking fields and collecting artifacts, but he didn't have a car. So he wasn't able to actually do it, which is why he focused a lot on trying to write histories of indigenous people in Maryland based on basically archival material, because that's what he had access to. And he had been asked if he would start a professional organization, or sorry, a amateur association of archaeologists in the 20s. And he said he wasn't sure if there were enough people interested. And, he finally was like, you're really good at this. I think that you should seriously think about helping to start an organization. He also pushed uh, Mayr to possibly publish his work in American antiquity. He thought his work was good enough to be published at that level, although Mayr did not. I think he was self-conscious about his lack of education, and he never did publish at that level, although I believe he could have. And so William Mary starts sending amateur archaeologists who contact him to Tom and saying, hey, there's this great archaeologist down in Arundel County. You should talk to him. So this isn't a letter Luckily, he would often copy his answers to people. He would have the original letter that was sent to him, and then he would hand copy the letter he sent back to them. So thank God. Um, and in it, he writes, I make a distinction between amateur archaeologists, serious students, and collectors, pot hunters for these reasons. Great care should be taken to keep the society a truly scientific body. A predominant element of the latter class in the society would result in it being a mere antiquarian or Indian relic club, where relics are hunted, which heaven forbid. When the society is once well recognized, collectors could and should be admitted, since one of the aims of the society should be the propagating of the scientific attitude among local collectors. And I think this is why you see now in ASM a big focus on semi-professional training of amateur archaeologists. That doesn't happen in every archaeological society in every state. It's fairly unusual to have such a rigorous training as people have at the ASM. And it is partially because very, very early on, I mean, this is 1938, the people who end up starting these associations truly believe that there is a difference between buying artifacts or collecting pretty arrowheads. He would refer to them as like pretty arrowheads or cool, basically piles of cool looking stuff. He was truly concerned that a group had to be semi-professional because otherwise they don't understand that the artifacts are only should be collected so they can give you data about people. It's about people, not stuff. Now, eventually, the history of the Archaeological Society of Maryland is like incredibly complicated, and I barely understand it because there was a lot of fighting factions. You may be shocked to hear. Um, and so although he was first approached in the 30s, he eventually became a founding member of the original Archaeological Society of Maryland when it was a section of the Maryland Academy of Sciences in the 1950s and early 1960s. And the Maryland Academy of Sciences eventually became what is in the Maryland Science Center. Um, and members of the Academy ASM were very unhappy with leadership at the ASM, and they had no control. They were never allowed to publish. They had raised hundreds, like $700 for publishing, and this was in the late six or early 60s. And the um, Maryland Academy of Sciences said, well, that's our money. We can use it for publishing or not. It's up to us. You're just a section. And they had a constitution and bylaws, and they were struck down by the Maryland Academy of Sciences, and they were just given a list of rules because they said that you have no independence. So people got very unhappy. I have letters where people are like, no taxation without representation. And they decide to basically vote themselves out. They disbanded the group by vote in 1964 and restarted the organization as an independent nonprofit, which is the Archaeological Society of Maryland that we know today. And Thomas Mayr signed the incorporation papers for what we know of today as the Archaeological Society of Maryland. He signed those incorporation papers. He was a founding member of both the Academy ASM in 1953 and the Independent ASM in 1965. And this is a photo of him giving a ceramic talk in 1965 with some of the other founding members of the ASM. Some of the other founding members' names are Thomas Nelson H. Tidings, Harry A.H. Ewald, I don't know how you pronounce it, I'm sorry, Ewald, Norman E. Bryce, and Frederick M. Steiner. And these are just a few of the really interesting stories that are about the history of Maryland archaeology, that are important sites. So for example, the Ruff site and the Beck site are a National Register site that was eventually protected in the 1980s and was bought as a park. And now they have a lot of excavations. Like he started working at the rough site in 1929, and we have maybe dozens of boxes of artifacts of this very unusual village site. It clearly was a village. Unfortunately, he actually did excavations where he kept artifacts in different contexts separate in paper bags that were labeled, but the glue failed on all the paper bags, so they all mixed together. But you know what, he did what he was supposed to. So you can't help glue. Um, and we're just starting to analyze a lot of these artifacts. So part of our grant was updating documentation and cataloging artifacts for 15 sites. Now, if you remember, we have represented almost 200 sites. And so we picked 15, mostly the 15 biggest sites, and we've cataloged those. We are in the last stages of finishing a report going over our findings, which include we have in a combination of Henry Sturdy and Thomas Mayr, about 10 to 15 notebooks full of um, site visit notes that we've had volunteers, thank God for our volunteers, they transcribed. And we're kind of trying to get all this information together for the state. There's a lot of information that's nowhere else. I just happened to yesterday as I was going through, like I said, we had 3 days to go through every single room, and we were just literally opening drawers and finding paper in every room, like guest bedrooms, like just everywhere. So we're still going through a lot of that material. And I found two site reports, one from Henry Wright from the 60s and one from I can't remember who, but it was a semi-professional archaeologist also in the 60s. And I don't think they exist anywhere else. And these are fairly important sites. So finding like original photographs from excavations that I don't believe the state has. So we are working hard to get this information out and share it with all the counties, share it with the state. I was just telling Rebecca that we have from the 1930s some of the newsletters from the Natural History Society of Maryland, their archaeology club, basically. And by newsletters, I mean they're like 25-page reports that go into detail about excavations and all kinds of things, beautiful maps, and I haven't seen them anywhere else. So it's possible there's copies somewhere, but I am going to, as soon as I can, scan those and share them. Um, so to close, I really want to read a small part of the tribute that Tyler Bastian, who was the first state archaeologist of Maryland, gave at the 1986 Archaeological Society of Maryland Spring Symposium after Tom's passing. He gave basically a eulogy. Um, One of his proudest archaeological accomplishments was the excavation of the Rough Site and his definition of the Selby Bay phase. In 1957, he advanced the cause of Mid-Atlantic archaeology with his definition of this phase, and this phase definition has stood the test of time. He loved to contemplate issues concerning the lifeways of the Selby Bay phase Indians, their origins, the nature of their trading relationships to procure exotic lithics, and their evolution into subsequent societies. Tom Mayr has now gone to find the answers to all these unanswerable questions. I know that he will find this new adventure as rewarding and fulfilling as he found his life with us. His memory was unfailing, and our memory of him will not fade. Through the lives that he enriched, his memory will be cherished. Through the collection he accumulated, his life's work will continue to expand knowledge. And through his publications, his insights will inspire the dialogue that he so enjoyed. He loved the sounds of the forest, the uniqueness of his coastal waterfall, the call of the geese, a stimulated debate, and the excitement of a new discovery. His life was rich, his accomplishments many, his friends dear, and his family loving. His passing leaves a profound silence that he would hope is of short duration. His wish was that others will continue the battle to preserve the past and to search for answers about our Indian ancestors who shared his love for the tidal rivers of the Chesapeake. And I am hoping to continue sharing his work and letting people know about all the important finds he had and let his voice continue. Um, I want to thank and acknowledge Thomas Mayr, Henry Sturdy, and their families for their contributions to Maryland archaeology through the collection, the documentation, the donation of these artifacts. Thank you to Maryland Historical Trust for funding the work we've done so far. Valerie Hall is the different Valerie Hall than from the ASM, a lead researcher for the project, and she's done so much work on it. Sean Sharp and Drew Webster, who work at the lab with me, and we have had a lot of interns with Anne Arundel County and Lost Towns, and volunteers who have put in over, well, it's way more than this by now, probably 3,400 to 4,000 hours of washing, labeling, sorting, boxing artifacts, transcriptions, cataloging, just endless amounts of work. And oh, that is all. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really
Yes.
exciting to hear about his ideas and ethics related to archaeology and how innovative he was for his time, and that amateurs, like those of us in our clubs, can do a lot and really promote the field in ways that can be really influential in the long term.
Yes. And in fact, in the 60s, after the ASM started, it turns out I found in correspondence he had with an archaeologist out of Virginia. He was a professional and also the president of the Archaeological Society in Virginia. And he said, "Oh, I can see what you're doing with legislation." And that was, I'm really, congratulations. Let me know how it's going. And I found a newspaper article, actually earlier today, which interviewed Tyler Bastian and other people when in 1969 when he was first hired. And basically, there had been legislation to create an archaeological office in the state, and it failed. So the ASM actually fought for 2 years, 3 years to get an archaeologist hired in any section of the state. And eventually legislation passed that got an archaeologist hired within the Maryland Geological Service. And that also came along with antiquities laws protecting archaeological sites. And this was in like I think it was 1967 when it was started, which is very early for antiquities laws. So Maryland really pioneered a lot of this, and which is makes sense now why we have such great laws for some of the counties that are very unusual in all over the country.
Very cool. So for the 15 sites that you've really focused on the artifacts for, how have you been going about the cataloging? Are you digitizing everything or how is
It's
that
literally
working?
just a it's a Google Sheets catalog. So Anne Arundel County has got a huge collections. We are basically part of Lost Towns Project. Anne Arundel County and Towns Project is kind of the same thing. We have uh, about 2,000 boxes of artifacts that we keep. We keep all the compliance artifacts, but we also have like London Town, all these huge research projects that we have. So we already have our own cataloging system, and that we've had for years that we use already. So we just use that, and it's literally a drop-down spreadsheet. It is could not be less fancy, but it gets it done, and that's good because that means that it's the less complicated, the less likely it is to break down, and you're
Mhm.
less likely to lose data over time. So we have right now we have all 15 sites in one database that we are going to be so that we can easily share it with the state. Um, and some of the sites are complicated because they're going to have to be redrawn. What we've learned is that they're a different size than they said they were originally. I found that the National Register site, half of it was mapped on the wrong spot um, very early on. Yeah, it's great. So there's a lot of paperwork that goes along with it where we are trying to help the state fix problems in past documentation that makes sense because they didn't have access. They had access to one of his notebooks that he had shared a copy of, and none of the rest of them. So they knew very little. And he actually has fabulous maps that are so well done, they actually line up to actual maps, his hand-drawn maps. And he writes like he will break big sites up into subsections, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And he also wrote a letter to the Smithsonian asking how they labeled artifacts. And they sent a letter back saying, like, here's the kind of ink we use, here's the colors we use. So a lot of these artifacts are labeled. So that really, really helped. Really helped.
It's pretty incredible that
I
that
know.
he actually did all that research and labeled everything
I
properly.
know. It's great. Carolyn said that she actually labeled a lot of them. She was like, "Oh, I remember some of these. I wrote so small." Yeah. But it's pretty, and there's things that he he had so many what he called nutting stones, basically mortars. He had so many of them that they were outside around trees. He remembered where they all came from, but he had dozens of mortars. And look at some of the things he found. He had boxes and boxes of giant axe heads. And you're like, oh, wow, I can see why we don't find any of these things anymore. They picked them all up in like 1938. Um, just amazing, gorgeous, just the most amazing artifacts that I've seen. Not, I mean, so many ceramics. And Valerie Hall, who's working with us, did her master's on the ceramics collection, indigenous ceramics collection that is held with Jeff Pat at the Mac Lab. And she said, oh my God, they have like a tenth of this. They don't have anywhere near this amount. And I'm sure many of them are mendable. Sometimes you get portions of mended rims that are like barely curving and they're 10 inches wide, just amazing stuff. So if anybody wants an internship, I
Joe has
just,
a question. Go ahead and
yeah.
unmute and
Yeah.
ask.
Uh, you hear a lot about researchers or people who are interested in fields having collections, and their families or their organization eventually throw them out because of the
Oh, yeah.
fact that they don't want them, or they don't have room for them, or the person taking their place has no interest in them. Is there any organization or effort being made to try to save these collections so that potentially valuable material doesn't get lost in some landfill due to just the lack of interest and lack of space and lack of knowledge that this may be important?
Yes, actually, Anne Arundel County has quite a few donated collections. Um, Thomas Mayr's collection itself, the state archaeologist, we actually were out at the rough site doing some work, and Zach and Matt came up to me. They were helping us out there and said, you won't believe it, but someone from the Mayr family just contacted us and said they wanted to donate the collection. They were like beside themselves with excitement. They said, we've been trying to get them to donate this collection for years. So it happens in multiple ways. First, we continue conversation. Sometimes with a lot of these people and their families, we might have known them, or they might have known older archaeologists who they stay in contact with, and they make it known that we are likely to, if there's artifacts from Anne Arundel County, we will we will likely take the collection. We also took the Ogle collection, which is probably the largest amateur collection that existed, and got a huge grant. It took us a couple years, but they eventually got sent to the Mac lab after we analyzed them and got them stabilized and things like that. So we are known, and we continue to try to be known by going to any kind of fair that we can. We table at all kinds of events so that we can let it be known that we exist, who we are, and have conversations continuously with just citizens throughout the county to get the word out that we are available if they have any collections. And we have little collections donated to huge collections all the time. But we're always trying to do better. But, it's hard to, sometimes it's hard to figure out how to communicate to people. But we have a very robust public component, and we have volunteers that come to our lab weekly. I can see some of our volunteers now in the audience. And so we work really hard to let people know why artifacts are important, and ask for them to think of us when they get rid of them. And this was the Mayr family at this point, the his kids are in their 70s and they're about to sell their house. So that's why we had 3 days, because they were like, we barely have time to deal with this, but we really want to make sure they go. So we knew that this would be important to him. So um, that's why they contacted us, is because even though they really didn't have time for us to deal with it, they wanted to make sure they were taken care of.
Okay, I do have a follow-up question.
Yeah,
What was the occupation of Mr. Mayr?
he worked at the post office
Okay,
in Fort Meade. Yeah, postal U.S. Post Service.
okay,
That's why everything was packed in money order boxes.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
There's a question in the chat. Grace wants to know if you'll be willing to come back once everything is cataloged to tell us more about everything he collected.
I'd be happy to. I mean, it might be a while because we're working on lots of different projects, so we kind of have to do a little bit at a time unless we can get a grant. We might apply for another grant to continue our work because it's pretty important. Um, but I'd be happy to. I'd also be happy to kind of do a show and tell. It's very interesting, kind of how the process we had to go through to identify sites. So we had to go to land records because he would often identify an area by who owned the property, who owned the farm. And if the site hadn't been identified yet, we had to go look through land records to figure out who is Winters. Winters is actually the name of a farmer. Um, and he lived next door to Lurch, who was also a farmer. Um, and so there's a lot of land record and reading hints in his notes and finding like weird sketch maps and references to certain inlets or something. So we do book. I can see somebody just asked about volunteering. Um, we are we sign up volunteers through Lost Towns Project. If you find the Lost Towns Project website, you can just Google that, and there's a volunteer page you can go to. There's a link there for signing up. We're um, only doing we have basically 4 people at a time right now, Tuesdays and Wednesdays from 10 to 12 and then from 12 to 3, but you can sign up for multiple sessions. It's just a way to split it up. We have finished a lot of our easier work. Like we had a lot of washing for a long time and labeling. And right now we are cataloging a lot of artifacts. So we are in the midst of doing a lot of um, training. So we're doing lectures on ceramics, lectures on glass, and trying to help people be able to sit with us and catalog.
Do you
And we're
have these
happy to do that.
lectures posted anywhere?
Oh, no, because it's very, we literally sit around the table. We haven't gotten that organized. That's a great idea. Um, and maybe, and that might actually be good once we have done them a few times and we figure out what works.
Mhm.
We're also working on I'm working on our teaching collections. We have a ceramics one that's like maybe 80% done. I'm working on a glass teaching collection. Oh, I forgot to also add that we have a huge reference collection through the Anne Arundel County Public Library that's called the Joan Cass Beck Collection. And we get money every year. She was a volunteer with us who worked for the library, and she um, left us money in her will. And now we get like $3,000 a year to buy any books we want. So we have a collection of archaeology, architectural history, um, the history of 17th century dress, base, fish skeletons, like anything you can think of that you would normally see only in college libraries. We've got in a reference collection. And you just have to email us. You can find it on the Anne Arundel County Public Library website. If you search for books, they'll say it's in our collection, and you contact us and come and see it. We are actually, Glen Burnie Library is about to be rebuilt, and when it is, we are going to get a huge section of the library where our collections will be, the Joan Cass Beck book collection will be, and we will have our public lab there as well.
Oh, that's very exciting. That
I
sounds
know,
great.
I mean, ground has not been broken, but it'll get there.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the Lost Towns project that you've mentioned?
Okay, yeah, Lost Towns Project was basically the started by Al Lukenbach in I think late 80s or early 90s. And He was the first county archaeologist, and I believe he started with a nonprofit, the Lost Towns Project, as an archaeologist, excavating, trying to find the original settlements in Anne Arundel County, which were in Providence in 1649, which is basically the peninsula just north of Annapolis, where the Bay Bridge is, and the Broadneck Peninsula. And he also did huge amounts of excavations at London Town. If anybody grew up in the area, they probably had to go to a field trip to London Town at some point. And then he became a county archaeologist in the 90s, and which was very early for a county archaeologist to exist. And he actually helped shepherd in some of the strictest laws protecting archaeological sites and requiring archaeology that I've heard of literally in the country. Any sort of uh, construction permit that someone has to get, even a private citizen, usually has to go through cultural resource review. Um, so there's a lot of really important protection for archaeology in our county. So that is a uh, outgrowth of the Lost Towns Project and some of the really important early archaeologists. And he also was one of the archaeologists who did a lot of work with the public. So he would have kids come and be able to screen while he was digging. And they used a lot of volunteers, which is why we have such a great volunteer program now. If you talk to archaeologists throughout the Mid-Atlantic, I would say 80% of them have worked in Anne Arundel County or have something to do with the Lost Towns Project. It's because we train a lot of interns, and um, archaeologists come to do projects with us all the time. So we have amazing collections that we need to do a lot of work on. So if anyone is interested in anything in particular, or they have a certain forte or whatever, contact us. If you know anyone in your family who's a college student, might want to intern. We do internships, paid internships in the summer, and then internship credit internships during the year. So
Thank you so much. Does
oh,
anybody
you're
else have
welcome.
any additional questions? Well, I'm going to ask, do you have any general ideas about where a lot of the ceramics, like the people that who fabricated the ceramics that are in the Mayr collection?
Yeah, so they were likely, they would have been part of the Piscataway Confederacy. So the Piscataway Confederacy, the center of it was Mayonne, which was the capital, and that was at the confluence of the Patuxent River and Piscataway Creek, which is Prince George's County. It's now Piscataway Park. Um, and the Piscataway Creek, the headwaters of it are a little less than 7 miles east of the Patuxent. So they are very close. And the Piscataway, by the time Europeans came, people have been making ceramics for about 3,000 years. So at that point, when Europeans came, the Piscataway had formed a confederacy with a lot of the smaller groups that you will see mentioned on maps, like John Smith's maps will mention names of villages and names of um, bands and things like that. And a lot of those people were part of the Confederacy, partially to protect from incursions by the Susquehanna from Pennsylvania. And they had just finished a big war with the Susquehanna. And there was kind of a confederacy of groups um, they were loosely led by the head Tayak in Mayonne. So, like, there were smaller sub rulers all over the place, including on the Eastern Shore. So, the Piscataway still exist. They're state recognized tribes. There's three groups of the Piscataway: Piscataway Indian Nation and the Piscataway Conoy, and then the Cedarville Band of the Piscataway. And they are descendants of the ancestral Piscataway, some of whom also kind of were chased north and joined the Onondaga. So there's a lot of Piscataway. I think it's the Onondaga with the five tribes, and so there's actually a really great Gabrielle Tyack was the first curator for the Smithsonian's American Indian Museum, and she wrote a little book that's available on the Internet Archive. I can't remember the name of it, but Gabrielle. Tyac is Tayyac, Tyac. Um, spirits in the trees or spirits in the river or something like that. But they asked her for context because they were on ancestral, the museum was on ancestral Piscataway lands. So she wrote this real, I mean, it was like 100 pages and I read it in a couple hours. It was really well written. She does a lot of public work, education and stuff like that. She's a professor, I think, in Western Maryland. And and it was like it just explained everything so clearly and so well. So if anyone's curious, I highly recommend checking that out.
Thank you so much for the
Oh, you're
recommendation.
welcome.
Any other questions for Jennifer? Have you worked with Indigenous leaders and with Piscataway to tell them anything about the collections or have them come
Not
and
this
view them?
collection, just because we are so early into like what we have, but
Hmm.
they do know we have it. We have worked with the Piscataway, the Conoy specifically, but we also have talked to members of the Piscataway Indian Nation. The Cedarville Band doesn't really talk to archaeologists much, but we've talked with them in general about collections we have, and we've had members of the Piscataway and elders who to talk with us about like what are you interested in learning, and they've told us, hey, we'd love to know more about specifically like soapstone. They're very interested in soapstone because that was a really important trade good for them. They would trade for really good lithic materials from Ohio and things like that, because the material here, the stone is not that great for making tools, but they have soapstone here and soapstone quarries. So they would trade to Ohio where they didn't have such great soapstone for lithics. And so they wanted to teach the kids in the tribe about these complex economic systems they had created. Um, and so we had an intern who helped us like start creating tables uh, literally with photos and identification and like really high quality photos from all different directions of material so that they could see what we had. They were interested in things like shark's teeth that might have been worn because you find those sometimes as pendants. So particularly fossilized shark teeth. And there was just a few other things. And so like we're constantly in contact with them. And Valerie Hall is actually the represents the particularly the Piscataway Indian Nation as an archaeologist. And I'm friends with her, so that helps. But we've had a relationship with the Piscataway Conoy for a long time. We try not to make them do too much work because it's a fine line. You don't want to ask them to do a lot for you. You want to try to have a dialogue so that you can try to do as much as you can without them having to do things for you.
Very understandable. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm very excited to hear about everything that you're working on, and
Oh, yeah.
the library project sounds amazing, and it sounds like it would be a great space for all of you.
Yes. And maybe I can come back and do a talk about like maybe like one of the sites and sh show some of the things we have and what we've learned, new things we've learned um, from the
That would be
collections as we're
wonderful.
analyzing them. So once we get a little further, I'd be happy to.
That would be great. We would appreciate that.
Well, thank you guys for asking me and for being great, I don't know, great listeners and asking good questions. I'm glad that everybody's curious about this. It's such a cool collection that I kind of excited to be able to tell people about it.